Fine. Okay, wonderful. All right, Tony, if you're ready, we'll get started here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Art and Dialogue, Rebellion in America with Anthony DiMaggio. My name is Stacy Brennan, and I am the Curator of Education for the Lehigh University Art Galleries. Just a few logistics before we begin this evening. I will give a brief overview of our Doing Democracy exhibition, which we're thankful to have Tony here to offer a presentation in conjunction with that, as well as Tony's presentation and his presentation on his recent publication, Rebellion in America. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and discussion. We are going to be recording this presentation this evening, just so you are aware. And you're welcome to unmute if you have questions or put things in the chat. I will help to moderate any questions at the end, or bring up any points that you put in there to Tony. Thank you. So this presentation, as I mentioned, is offered in conjunction with our current exhibition, Doing Democracy, Photography from the George Stephanopoulos Collection. The exhibition, as described in the title, is really a continued conversation around democracy and the ongoing practice of active participation and engagement in the democratic process. The art galleries are dedicated to serving the community as a space for exploration and learning from diverse perspectives. Last spring, we worked with students and faculty from the departments of history, political science, communication, journalism, and art, architecture, and design to co-curate the exhibition. The exhibition really offered an opportunity for students to identify topics and themes that resonated with them from a selection of 500 photographs that were donated from the journalist George Stephanopoulos. From the 500, we selected 107 which can be seen arranged into clusters or groupings of photographs that tell the story of democracy in the United States and shine a light through a photographer's lens on the significant events from the 20th century to the present. The photos really feature images from the civil rights movement, leaders and individuals who provide sources of strength and leadership, everyday Americans, politicians, and the media. And really, our hope is that this exhibition will provide a platform for participants from all different political perspectives and ideologies to share their ideas and opinions and spark ideas about what citizenship, activism, and democracy means to you. This, I think, goes really well with the topic of our discussion this evening. And if you're interested in seeing the works from the exhibition, they will be on view in the main galleries at Zollner through May by appointment, or you can come during our gallery hours, which are Tuesday through Friday, 11 to 5. And you can also view many of the works or reproductions of the works on the South Bethlehem Greenway through the end of August. In addition, all of the works are available on our website at LUAG.org, as well as recordings from past presentations and events. It's my pleasure to now to introduce and turn the mic over to Tony DiMaggio, Anthony DiMaggio, Associate Professor of Political Science, as he really unpacks the world of propaganda, media, and American politics from his current publication, Rebellion in America, Citizen Uprising, the News Media, and the Politics of Plutocracy. The publication is available for free at a link, which is in the event description on our website, and we will also put it in the chat today, so I hope you will take advantage of accessing that, as well as the follow-up article that Anthony published in Roar magazine. Anthony is an associate professor of political science, as I mentioned, and author of 9 books on a variety of topics that revolve around mass media and politics. And he has been an active participant in social movement politics for the last 2 decades, as well as an avid social commentator. So we're so thankful to have you here this evening, Anthony. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the mic over to you, and I'll stop sharing so you can take the screen as well.
Thank you. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank Stacy for inviting me to be a part of the Art and Dialogue series and the Doing Democracy exhibition. It was really interesting looking through some of these photos from the George Stephanopoulos collection, because to give you some context, I teach the history of American social movements from the 1950s through the present. So it's interesting that a lot of these photos end up overlapping with when I teach about the civil rights movement, right? And the anti-war movement of the 1950s and 60s and early 1970s. And then I relate those lessons back to the modern era of protest. So there are these lessons that you can draw from different periods in American history when we talk about social movements and different waves of protest throughout history. So that's what I was going to do today, and talk a little bit about these different waves and what we can learn about them in terms of similarities. I know we've got this thing in America where like anything more than 5 minutes old is ancient history, right? But there really are lessons that can be learned in terms of the way in which history sometimes repeats itself, or at the very least rhymes. So yeah, what I want to talk about is, and I'm actually, if you could bear with me for a second, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint here really quickly. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can people see this okay? Okay, good. So yeah, make sure I've got the right slide I'm starting with here. Yeah, I believe I do. Okay, so yeah, what is the significance here? When we talk about Black Lives Matter, this is actually a chapter in the book out of many. The George Floyd protests, this is sort of actually like not very timely with regard to my book, because my book comes out in April of 2020. Talk about a real downer there, because then the George Floyd protests emerged by June of 2020. So the book is 2 months off. So I end up having to update the book and some of the data and lessons from the book with the Roar article. So if you're interested in, what the chapter in the book talks about with regards to Black Lives Matter is like the Ferguson protests in 2014 with regards to Michael Brown's death. It also looks at Freddie Gray in 2015 in the Baltimore protests and the significance of these two waves of protest for the rise of Black Lives Matter. And then I relate this back to the progression of the movement with my Roar essay, right? And some more recent data. So what is the historical significance of the George Floyd protest? Well, if you look at some of the recent polling data, like the estimates that we're seeing is something like 10-11% of Americans said that they had participated in these protests in the summer of 2020. So you're talking about, if these numbers are to be taken seriously, 26 to 27 million people, which would make this maybe the largest turnout for a social movement in American history. So we really are talking about history in the making here, right? Who are we talking about here? Well, if you look closely at these polls, and this is something I talk about in the Roar piece, there are some very specific demographic groups that are more likely to say that they participated in these protests and also that they supported the protests. In terms of participants, it includes younger Americans, people 18 to 29, Democratic Americans, and people who tend to be more highly educated. If you look at people who say they support the movement, similar groups, young people, 18 to 29, Democrats, highly educated, but also Black Americans and high income Americans. So why do these demographic groups matter? Well, it tells you that this movement really is a mass movement in the sense that it's bringing a lot of different demographic groups together, right? A lot of different types of groups within this 26 to 27 million people. So there's a wide range of demographic groups here that are united in trying to spotlight questions related to racism and police brutality. And I think this is really important because, when I talk to my students about social movements, I really stress with them that there are these two periods in modern history of the mainstreaming of protest in America. One is the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with regard to the civil rights movement, right, from the 50s onward, and then moving into the anti-war movement, women's rights, and then the environment. And so that's that era of the mid to late 50s through the early 1970s. And now, really, 2010 onward, really, with the rise first of the Tea Party and then the Madison, Wisconsin protests against Governor Scott Walker, the labor protests, right? Occupy Wall Street, Fight for 15, the living wage movement, right? Environmental activism, anti-Trump protests, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too. in addition to other types of activism that have come to the front. And so we really are in an era right now of the mainstreaming, again, of mass protest. In 2018, almost 60% of Americans said they were so angry about an issue, they were angry enough to go protest. Whether they would actually go protest or not is another question, but they said that they were willing to. And so depending on the issue, you know, you would see like as many as 1 in 10 to 1/4 of Americans saying that they were willing to protest on an issue if it was related to one of these things, either Black Lives Matter and issues of race and racial inequality, LGBTQ plus related issues, sexual harassment or assault and women's rights and Me Too, gun related issues, gun rights, and immigration. You know, these were the big ones that people were talking about when they said they were willing to go out and protest. So we really are living in that era of mass protest. The book, the thesis of the book, to put it simply, is that you know, mass protest should be understood as the primary way in which democracy becomes real. Particularly when we talk about progressive change, like, and when I say progressive, I mean the expanding of democratic representation for groups historically that feel like they've been left out of the democratic process. And so this speaks to the idea of the plutocracy problem. Like a lot of political scientists in recent years have pointed out with a lot of good data and studies that our political system tends to very heavily bias affluent Americans, particularly the top 1 to 5 to 10% of Americans in terms of income. So that's what people mean when they say plutocracy, this idea of a political system that's dominated by people with money. So how do you challenge that? It doesn't make democracy impossible, but it makes it difficult, right? So that's where social movements come in. And so that's where the Doing Democracy series, I think, is really important, or the Doing Democracy exhibition. And so this art and dialogue series is important. So like when we look at some of these pictures, right, I think this is really, it's fascinating when you go through some of these pictures in the exhibition. This picture from Fred Tunn is April 30th, 1965, Madison, Wisconsin. This is approximately 270 civil rights marchers that went to the Capitol Assembly Chamber to speak in favor of a bill to ban discrimination, racial discrimination. So if you know about this period, you know that this is 4 months before the federal government signed into law the U.S. Voting Rights Act, right? Which made it illegal to discriminate against people based upon skin color. You're talking about the making illegal, the prohibiting of things like discrimination in voting based upon the grandfather clause, the poll tax, literacy tests, and so on and so forth. And really empowering people, right, with the Voting Rights Act to institute like a monitoring regime, right, that can be implemented through the courts to make sure that states are actually protecting voting rights, which is what happens after the Voting Rights Act is passed, and giving people actual legal standing to sue in court and challenge discrimination, right? And so this is something that continues to be relevant to this day. So, you know, this is a really important picture that sort of speaks to and puts you within this time period in terms of what's going on with regards to the rise of and mainstreaming of protest, and in this case, with regard to the civil rights movement. Also, you know, as I mentioned in my class, and I talk about a lot, the anti-war movement of the late 60s and early 1970s. This is a picture from April of 1971 by Leonard Freed. This is an anti-war rally at the Capitol building. This is really, if you're talking about 1971, the height of anti-war activism in the United States. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are showing up in the nation's capital to protest the war. This is really the mainstreaming, right, of the anti-war movement at this point, as you can guess from looking at this picture and the mass turnout, right? You've got the return of anti-war veterans who become more active in this movement by the early 1970s, between 1970 and 1973 particularly. The continued participation of student activists who had been active since the mid-60s and earlier. The funneling of civil rights activists into participating even more in this movement than they had already been by the late 1960s. So yeah, you've got this anti-war activism, you've got the civil rights activism, and obviously the exhibition is speaking to these movements. And also, you know, this idea of a commitment to nonviolent activism is something I want to bring into in a minute, once we look at the last picture. Okay, so this is a picture from Henry Burroughs. This is a rally near the White House, as you can see, obviously. You can see the White House in the picture in the background. Lafayette Park, right across the street. This is March 14th, 1965. This is a civil rights rally organized by DC Citizens Committee for Federal Protection in Alabama. Well, if you know the name of the group, right, that I just mentioned, then you know that this is a response to the brutal beatings of marchers. In the case of the march that was going on, or the attempted march between Selma and Montgomery, right, in Alabama, for voting rights. This is the Bloody Sunday incident, right? If you're interested in a visual representation, the one I usually show my students is the dramatized narrative from the film Selma, right? Which is a decent enough introduction for students, I think. But the Bloody Sunday event is, you're talking about a week before this, right? March 7th, 1965. What happened here? You're talking about the county sheriff, Jim Clark, and state troopers that he mobilized, and armed police attacking civil rights activists, clubbing them, gassing them, these nonviolent marchers, the sheriff ordering and deputizing white men, any white men over 18 to the courthouse to be honorary deputies, to go help to violently put down nonviolent civil rights activists and marchers taking part in this symbolic march. Klanners, Confederates showing up, engaged in this violent counter-mobilization. So what's the tie-in here when we talk about Black Lives Matter? This is something I want to get to. When we talk about these pictures and what they suggest, what they evoke in terms of the images here. What we're really talking about here in terms of a parallel between the 1960s and the present with these images is that we're talking about the return of an old narrative. You had these movements here, the civil rights era activists with the rise of this Martin Luther King-led movement, but the movement in general, and also anti-war activism. These movements were explicitly premised upon nonviolent activism, right? And, the anti-war movement itself explicitly premised upon the idea that violence is wrong, right? So this is not to say that everybody associated with the anti-war movement was nonviolent. Obviously, you have the case of the Weathermen, right? And you have these extenuating sort of circumstances and these select individuals who didn't fit the mold. But overwhelmingly, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement stood for nonviolence. And that is not the image that Americans were receiving by the late 60s to early 70s from people in power. The Nixon era, and then following that, the Reagan administration and the Bush one, there were these attacks, and a lot of times scholars refer to this as coded language. The war on crime, the war on drugs, these were informal ways in which language was used, in which people oftentimes talk about this. For example, Michelle Alexander, she wrote her book, The New Jim Crow. She talks about the way in which racial language is coded and racism is coded in a way where it appears to be colorblind, but is not. And so there's certain kinds of language that gets evoked that really is intended to be racist, but doesn't sound racist to people who aren't paying close attention. And what it ended up doing in the case of the civil rights movement, it was an effort explicitly to demonize a movement and discredit it without admitting that it was motivated by racism and without acknowledging that this was an overwhelmingly nonviolent movement. And so you have the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement being tarred together by the Nixon administration, which is trying to portray them as extremist, as violent, as beyond the pale. And this is something I want to talk about a little bit as I get into my book and the findings. So, Nixon becomes famous for this idea, or you could say infamous maybe, of the law and order backlash against this era and the mass protests. He does this speech in 1969 where he talks about the great silent majority of Americans. These are the people who pay their taxes and they go to work and they keep their heads down and they work hard, and damn it, they don't protest and get in people's faces. And, and he says to these people, quote, "I ask for your support. Let us be united," he says, "as we work for peace in Vietnam." And this is an explicit dig on the anti-war movement. And this is actually really important here because he's using this language of peace against the anti-war movement. And very implicitly here, members of the administration admit later that this language about the silent majority is also meant to be against the civil rights movement. And it's meant to be the beginning of this. It's the opening salvo of an attempt to discredit these mass movements and portray them as extremist and violent and contrary to what it means to be American. So the war on drugs and the war on crime end up being sort of code words for police efforts to target communities of color, poor communities of color disproportionately. And we now know, based upon data, a mountain of data that's been collected by criminologists, political scientists, sociologists, that when we look at things like the criminal justice system, incarceration, policing stops, drug arrests, and so on and so on, that there is a racial component in terms of systematic racial discrimination against people of color. So this goes back to the Nixon era. You know, it's not just this speech that talks about like what the difference is between good and bad Americans, but you can look back to some of the statements from people like John Ehrlichman. You know, John Ehrlichman was the White House counsel for domestic affairs. He did an interview with Harper's Magazine a couple of decades ago where he talked to a journalist named Dan Baum, and he laid out very explicitly what the Nixon people were doing behind closed doors when they started talking about this whole idea of the war on crime, which then in later decades became mobilized under Reagan and Bush 1 and was overwhelmingly concentrated against people of color in poor communities in terms of this idea of get tough on crime, get tough on drugs. And so I'm quoting John Ehrlichman here. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then by criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Well, that kind of matters. That's the end of the quote, by the way. That kind of matters because when you have a war on drugs that ends up being disproportionately focused on communities of color and poor communities of color, and when people of color are disproportionately arrested and prosecuted and incarcerated, and when the actual reality of the situation is that white people, people of color are not, neither one of those is more likely to use drugs, right? So this came from somewhere then. Like this was explicitly conceptualized under the Nixon administration as a way of criminalizing a group of people implicitly as a response to, in a very vindictive way, as a response to people of color asserting themselves through the civil rights movement. So this is really important because you have a movement that was overwhelmingly nonviolent, which was depicted as the opposite of that. So when you look at my PowerPoint, the second point here is very relevant. This is the idea of a George Orwell style propaganda. Black is white, night is day, up is down. Nonviolent is violent as long as you just say it enough times and equate something that was nonviolent with violence. And so you have something that was democratic dissent, right? The civil rights movement and anti-war activism, and this mobilization that then gets turned into the opposite in an Orwellian attack. So you invert public understandings of what a peaceful movement was in terms of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movements. So, you know, now we're getting into contemporary history here with regard to my book. You have the early sort of events that defined this movement with the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, in terms of the altercation with George Zimmerman, which is really the catalyst event, the initial one. You have the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014 and Eric Garner that year as well, and Laquan McDonald in Chicago. You have Freddie Gray in Baltimore in 2015. What these cases have in common is that they are all what I call in my book catalyst events. They all speak to frustrations that people of color had in these cities because you had cities themselves that had histories that have now been documented by the Department of Justice, which issued reports against these cities, where those cities had systematically and unfairly discriminated against people of color in the criminal justice process, particularly in poor neighborhoods of color, disproportionately populated by people of color in poor neighborhoods. And so, like, you know, the point I'm trying to get at here is that, like, these are like grievances that people had against the criminal justice system that are real things, right? Like, you know, maybe people didn't understand that. A lot of Americans didn't understand that. And so the idea was with Black Lives Matter that people needed to be educated if they didn't understand what people were experiencing within these communities with regards to law enforcement and discrimination. And so, you know, that brings us into the George Floyd protests of 2020. You know, now you're talking about a movement that I would say, you know, by 2020 had really become fully mature, right? When you're talking about 26 to 27 million protesters, that's really a quite incredible thing in terms of a mature mass movement. When I talk about this in my book, I draw on a political scientist from decades ago named David Truman. He was an interest group scholar, and he came up with an idea. It was an interesting idea. He talked about something called disturbance theory. It's pretty simple, actually. He said, you know what, you want to understand when people will become active? People will become active when they're mad as hell, after they feel like they've been denied something that they deserve, or they feel like they've been treated unfairly, like there's been something unjust that has happened to them, right? But something that sociologists have pointed out, and political sociologists, is that that doesn't always happen, right? Like, people suffer through all types of injustices, and sometimes, oftentimes, maybe most of the time, they suffer silently. And so what I'm doing in my book is I'm pointing out that I think that Truman had it right. That, you know, these movements that I'm talking about in my book, including Black Lives Matter, they are motivated by grievance very clearly, but it's not just grievance. It's also the catalyst event, right? There's an event that happens where there's the perception or an understanding that something egregious happened with each one of these cases. And that sets people off, right? That's the spark that lights the grievances that have always been there, that people tolerated quietly, silently, anxiously, angrily, right? And it sets it off. And then you have a wave of this stuff, and then it has an inertia, right? And it builds, wave upon wave upon wave with regards to Black Lives Matter. And this stuff takes on a life of its own because people join together and then they realize they're not alone in these concerns, right? And it feeds a movement. And so that's what we're really talking about here. These catalyst events feed a movement based upon grievance, based upon people who are disturbed at being denied fair treatment, right? So, you know, as I've been already saying here, just to go through this really quickly, you know, the background here, if you look at a lot of the studies done by criminologists and political sociologists and others, it's been pretty clearly documented. And I talk about it in the book. You know, you can look at the data. It's all there. We know that people are not treated the same in America based upon race. When you look at things like drug arrests, use of force incidents, capital punishment cases involving the death penalty, the ways in which the media stereotype people, and the ways in which they cover poverty, crime. And so, like, people are not treated equally in these systems. So this has led political sociologists and other social scientists to talk about something that people call systemic racism or structural racism, which is to say, if you're not familiar with those terms, you know, maybe you are, but if you aren't, that there are systems and ways in which people can be treated in racist ways, even if you as an individual don't see yourself as racist, right? Like, stereotypes can be perpetuated within systems in which people can implicitly or subconsciously perpetuate stereotypes and treat people differently, even if they don't want to see themselves as racist, right? And these things perpetuate themselves within systems. And so that's important to point out when you talk about modern racism. So, you know, I talk a lot about BLM in my book as a grievance-driven movement, obviously. And one of the things that they confronted pre-2014, moving into the beginning of this movement, is what I think there's no other way to really put this at this point, a culture of willful denial. Like, if you have a mountain of studies and data that show very clearly that people are not being treated equally based upon race in the criminal justice system, the only way to really miss that is to go out of your way to miss it. And you know, maybe, you know, there's this problem of ignorance. Maybe people aren't informed about something because they haven't been exposed to it, right? But we know that that's not the whole problem today, because there are millions of Americans now with multiple waves of Black Lives Matter protests where it has been brought to their attention, right, that there is something called systemic racism. And they still are not interested in talking about that. So now you're dealing with the problem of willful denial. right? Or willful ignorance. So that's really the challenge when we talk about a mass movement like this and how to make progress moving forward. So yeah, so, you know, we're talking about a movement right now, and a mass mobilization. You know, it's really quite incredible in terms of this mobilization, because with 2020, you're talking about 9,000 protest events, right? That's how many events happened in the United States in 2020. 93% of them were nonviolent. Think about that for a minute. Like, that's not what a lot of Americans think of when they think of BLM. In terms of the ways in which people tried to portray it as extremist, violent, defined by riots, extremism. I heard a lot of talk on Fox News and Breitbart and elsewhere, because I study the right, about how BLM was a terrorist organization. You know, 93% of these protests were non-violent, the overwhelming majority. So why pick 7% as the defining characteristic to describe a movement and describe the other 93% who were overwhelmingly nonviolent, unless you're going out of your way to misrepresent something? Now, maybe people do this because they're just not aware of the numbers. That's certainly possible. But, you know, it's also a misrepresentation, right? So that's something that's worth pointing out here. And this is a parallel when we talk about the civil rights era. You know, you've got a similar thing going on here. Really, it's a very strong, striking parallel where you have a modern civil rights movement, right? And it's the same exact tactic that was being used in the 1960s and early 70s to discredit the civil rights movement here. And it's the same characteristic of, you know, a movement that's overwhelmingly nonviolent. Like, sir, you had violence in the 60s too. No one's denying that. You had riots that were associated with the angst and anger of the 1960s and the segregation of that era, right? And the white supremacy of that era. No one's denying that those things happen. And that happens now too, but that did not define the civil rights movement overwhelmingly. Just like now, 93% of these protests are nonviolent. We have an estimate, in case people don't know, 25 people were killed in 2020 in protests, 25. Of those 25, 9 were killed in BLM protests, 9 people. Now, any death is a travesty, but I want to be clear here. When you hear people using the language of mass chaos, when you hear Donald Trump saying American chaos, law and order, you're talking about 9 people, right? And again, any death is a tragedy, but it's 9 people, number one. And number two, you can't put all of those deaths on BLM, because we have to be talking about BLM protesters and counter protesters, right? There are different actors within this process. So then it becomes even more complicated, right? You're not just talking about BLM, but you're talking about counter agitators who show up at protests with guns looking to provoke violence as well. For every BLM protest, you're talking about Jason Rittenhouse style vigilante violence as well, right? So this is not just about BLM when you talk about violence. Also, this is something really important to point out. There has been some recent social science research that suggests that BLM itself may have actually saved 300 lives by cutting down on police homicides, because there has been so much attention focused on police brutality that it has cut down on the amount of police homicides that would otherwise have occurred. That's some interesting research happening, but I don't think we give that enough of its due in terms of talking about that. So to really quickly sort of wrap up here, because I don't know how much time I have left. How am I doing on time, Stacey? I'm doing okay. All right. So what I'm doing in my book is I'm sort of tracing out the history of this movement. And what I'm doing in terms of original research is I'm looking at the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement tried to reach out to the mass public to actually connect on the grievances of the movement. And so, like, obviously part of this happens through social media in terms of mobilizing activists. But that's really not my main concern in the book. My main concern is the traditional news media. I actually show in my book how, through the process of people going out and protesting collectively, this movement has been very effective across multiple waves and iterations at drawing attention to some of these frames that I mentioned here on this slide. Things like police brutality specifically, racism in America in general, and with regards to policing and the importance of the fact that these are overwhelmingly peaceful protests. These are actually 3 themes that have been overwhelmingly common in the news. And these very favorable frames have been more dominant in the news. I show empirically, I actually document this empirically across many different news venues in my book. They have been much more common than the frames below, which are things like individual deviants. Like, you know, for each one of these, you could look at someone like a reporter sometimes did. Well, what about, you know, Michael Brown and Ferguson, right? What were the particulars of his interactions with Darren Wilson, the police officer? What about Freddie Gray in Baltimore, right? And his interactions with police, and why did he run from police or something? Like, certainly you could focus on that kind of stuff in each one of these case studies, right? Or you could focus on the fact that there were some people who were engaged in rioting, right? The whole idea of protester violence. Or you could focus on this whole idea that police are there to protect and serve. So when the National Guard gets called in, right, they're just there to protect and serve. And it's the protesters who are committing violence, right? Like, these are what you would call classic counter frames to try and delegitimize a movement. You know, what I'm showing in my book is that these kind of frames, while they were present in the coverage of these protests like Baltimore and Ferguson, they were not anywhere near as common as the favorable frames. So this is actually really good news if you're a BLM activist, right? This is very positive, practically significant findings, because it shows that if you're determined enough and you're active and you join together into a movement and you make your grievances heard collectively, you can use the media to get attention. And it's not just that you can get attention. I actually also show in my book that you can change people's minds. I show in the book that there's been a real profound change in the way that Americans look at race relations in this country, in terms of, number one, recognizing that there are some very real problems in race relations in America that people weren't willing to recognize pre-BLM. Like, there's been a really huge growth in the willingness of people to recognize this. Black Americans, white Americans, across racial boundaries, people are increasingly willing to do this by the late 2010s and early 2020s versus in the early 2010s. A really big shift. Increased support for the movement itself, Black Lives Matter. You can actually see that in these surveys from one year to the next, from the mid-2010s onward. An increased willingness to recognize that maybe our system doesn't treat people equally based upon race. You know, I'll give you some context here, just to give you one specific statistic to help flesh this out. In 2011, 49% of Americans agreed, quote, that our country has made the changes needed to give Blacks equal rights with whites. 49% agreed, 45% disagreed. This was from the Pew Research Center. And the American people were almost half and half on this question, right, in 2011. And it was about the same in 2014, right, when BLM was emerging, right, when you talk about Ferguson. It was 49-46 in 2014, right, split. The numbers by 2018 were 35-59. 35% said, yes, we have made these changes. 59% said no. This is a pretty big change, right? Like, this is a really big shift over a small period of time, 4 years. And the only big thing going on here with regards to this question in that 4-year period is BLM, right? And if you're still curious about whether it's BLM, you know, 21% of Americans said in 2021, according to Gallup, and I'm quoting here, recent protests, marches, demonstrations changed your views on racial justice and equality in America. So it's not like people are being shy about admitting this, right? Like, they are admitting that this mattered. What I actually show in my book is that people who paid a lot of attention to these protests in Ferguson and Baltimore became much more likely to be supportive of the grievances that were being expressed by protesters compared to people who weren't paying attention to the news coverage. So there was actually an effect. That's my second point on the PowerPoint slide. There was actually a media effect after you statistically controlled for things like political partisanship and ideology, and people in terms of gender and age, education level, race, yeah, a lot of different factors statistically. Like, media consumption was a big thing. Like, people who consumed the media became more sensitized as they paid attention to these stories, to the grievances. So there was a mass change among people of color and whites in terms of recognizing a problem and becoming more supportive of the movement. Now, so I think we're at a point right now where the question is policy change, right? That's what we're dealing with. Like, there were some changes that happened in places like Ferguson in terms of the way in which they went about changing their policing to try and stop being so blatantly discriminatory against people of color, in terms of changing their city council structure, in terms of implementing community policing agreements and federal monitoring regimes to look at those things to see if they were actually following through with trying to combat discrimination. And this was happening in cities like Chicago, Ferguson, Baltimore. I obviously don't think we're there yet, right? Because we still have these protests going on and with regard to George Floyd and onward, right? So this is a movement that is still ongoing. And there are still questions about where it's going to go, right? There's a discussion that's ongoing about defunding police versus other ways in which BLM can reach its goals. And so like the movement is not done. And obviously we can't come to a conclusion here in terms of where it's going to go from here. This is still a to be continued discussion, right? So, you know, that's sort of, I guess where I want to leave it here, right? In terms of my discussion and lecture, and I want to sort of open it up from there. And thank everybody for listening to my lecture.
Thank you, Tony. That was really interesting to hear you connect kind of the movements through time and touch upon the themes throughout them. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to unmute themselves, as well as to add comments in the chat. I'm happy to read them out for you.
Hi, Professor DiMaggio. Great talk, by the way. My question had to do with one of the unique things to me about BLM is that there seems to be no face or leader to the movement. So I'm wondering how that changes or affects attacks on these media attacks you're saying on Black Lives Matter, or like how they compare when it comes to public perception and their efficacy.
Is it Rayhan? Is that how you pronounce?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Like that would be a big distinguishing point when you look at, you know, Black Lives Matter as a social movement as compared to, let's say, you know, the civil rights movement, because, you know, there are some figures who you would say in the early BLM become symbolic leaders. Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors, Opal Tometi, right? But there's something different here, right? Like this is a very decentralized movement. It's very much localized in terms of like individual cities that are the focus points of like individual waves of these protests, and they do seem to be much more decentralized compared to like the previous civil rights movement. So like, how do we sort of make sense of that with regards to the media and the news coverage? Is that a liability? Like you're talking about, Rayhan, the way in which the media cover this. I guess the best way I can put this, and I don't know if this answers your question or not, you can please feel free to follow up if it doesn't answer your question. It doesn't seem to have slowed the movement down. If we're talking about like 26, 27 million people, right, who have become active, like I would argue that maybe this is like a huge asset, right? That the movement can be what people want it to be in different localities and in different places because it's decentralized, and it can respond to what people's concerns are in different places. And so it can be what people need it to be because it's decentralized. So maybe that's why it's so resilient. And maybe that's why, you know, it's been so effective at using the media. At least it seems to be, based upon my my case studies. That's what I'm finding.
That was a great question. It looks like Melly has her hand up. Melly, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Great talk, Tony. Thank you so much. My question is about, your findings are based on legitimate news media from what I'm understanding from your talk. And I feel like I know what that is. And I feel like you know what that is. And I feel like we probably mostly agree on what that is. I am concerned about where Americans now get their news from. And I know it's a little off the topic because your research is based on legitimate sources, but I guess my concern is, the average American's either ability or inability to be able to tell the difference and to create like a parallel narrative that doesn't actually match reality, I guess. And so, like I know Fox, for example, Fox News, they call themselves literally Fox News, but then when pushed, by whomever, they actually do admit we are an entertainment, that this isn't actually news, it's entertainment, but then they tell their viewers that they're news. So I'm just curious, how have you thought, I mean, I'm sure you've thought of it, but how this might figure into your research, or how to understand your research within that context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm working on a book right now called Fake News in America, which, so this has been a real reckoning. We're talking about a shift here, right? Because, so the book chapter that I'm talking about, these are case studies from like 2014, right? And 2015. So like, I would argue that in 2014 and 15, this is sort of like it's not a pre-social media era, but it's like, I would say it's really been since then that we've seen the dramatic rise in social media as a preferred venue or preferred venues for engaging in politics, right? So I think that it's probably less relevant in 2014 or 15 for this data, and more relevant now for what you're talking about. So when I'm looking at this in my chapter, I'm looking at venues like the New York Times, broadcast media, cable media, news wires, the Associated Press, some online sources like CNN.com, some local sources like, St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the case of St. Louis, and a couple other local sources. And so, like, it's an interesting point that you're making, because, like, I don't know, I think it's something that we're going to have to deal with moving forward. I think that particularly in the last couple of years, when you talk about the rise of QAnon, when you talk about the COVID era, there's just such a dramatic amount of disinformation out there, right? And misinformation.
Yeah, and I when you say we have to deal with it, I totally agree. I just don't know, you're the point that you had on one of your slides, the bullet point about the Orwellian kind of double speak of, this black is white and white is black, or, the sky is pink or whatever. It's impossible to have an actual discourse with a person who consumes their news from, 4chan or like any of those sources that are not actually news sources, right? They specifically exist to create disinformation. And so, like, it just feels very overwhelming and very scary to think that, what feels like a large percentage of our population, and maybe it's not large, maybe I'm just scared for nothing, but like, that there is a significant part of our population that literally gets it from there and believes it and follows that narrative, to a very destructive point.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, I think that you're talking about like pre-Trump. I remember doing these job talks and other research talks years ago, like 5 years ago. And it was probably like about 5% of Americans, 5 to 10, who were getting their news primarily from social media. And it's more than that now. So I think you're talking about, it may be like 10 to 20% now. I'd have to go back and look at the exact numbers, but it's a sizable number of people that you're talking about. So I think two things can be happening at once. Like, you can still have a situation where like the vast majority of people are getting traditional news, and that the stuff I'm talking about in my book is still relevant, and you can reach these people, right? But you have this growing number of people who are getting access to bad information, right? And that's a growing concern. So, we've got like a lot of moving parts to this. And I totally hear what you're saying, Melly. I think that like this is something that we have to deal with. And like the way that I've been putting this in my contemporary research, because it's something I'm increasingly concerned with, is that we have a crisis of education that we need to deal with. I think that we need to, at a K through 12 level and a higher education level, we need to seriously prioritize basic information literacy. I think it needs to be a fundamental part of the curriculum. I think that the only way that this is going to get solved, it's not going to happen through systematic curating of everybody's Facebook pages, because even if you could hire an army of people to censor people's pages, it raises all types of questions about what gets censored, right? Are there legitimate critical views that get taken out? And like, who's the decider on what gets censored and what doesn't, and if it's legitimate, right? So I think what we need to do is we need to be able to teach people from a very early age the ability and the skill to differentiate a good source from a poor source, misinformation from legitimate informed information, disinformation from serious information. And so like the only way to do that is to educate people in formal educational settings. And so if you can do that, right, then it becomes less of a concern that there's all this garbage out there, because people will know that it's garbage and they'll be able to distinguish between something that's legitimate and not, or at least that's the hope, right? That if we can do that at the K through 12 level and college level, that we can winnow some of this junk out and that it'll just fall by the wayside. That's my hope, at least. Like, I'm not idealistic yet, but I hope we can get there.
And speaking of misinformation, Declan had a great question. Why hasn't COVID had a mad like hell impact? And I don't want to influence his question, but I'm curious if the misinformation around COVID has affected the mad like hell impact.
You know, I don't want to downplay the number of deaths, because like you're talking about 500,000 people, that's a massive amount, right? But if you talk about the number of people infected, in terms of the formal numbers, I think it's what, like 30 million around, right? And the number of deaths is 500,000. So you're talking about, in terms of deaths, less than 1%. It's like 0.1%, I think. And number of infected, 10%. So I think the way to explain this is not to downplay those numbers, because they're really huge numbers, right? But it's to also point out that that also means that 90% of the population hasn't been infected directly. So they probably haven't seen firsthand what it looks like, and they haven't seen somebody in front of them die. So this is the kind of situation where somebody could be misinformed very easily by bad information, right? And so like if you're not working in an ER unit or something, or in a hospital, and you're not seeing this day in, day out, it could be very easy for that kind of misinformation to take hold. And I think that's a big part of the problem. A lot of the research I've been doing lately suggests that people who rely overwhelmingly on social media for their information on COVID are just falling into all types of disinformation and misinformation. And so, you know, like in terms of thinking things like the numbers have been exaggerated, that it's just like the flu, that you can deal with it with over-the-counter remedies, take some vitamin C or vitamin D or something and get back to work, and so on and so on. So yeah, I think that it's a combination of people not having firsthand experience, and also the disinformation.
That's a great point. And Vera, did you have a follow-up to your question? Any additional questions?
You're muted, Vera.
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, I just wanted to say that I think that it, particularly you can see with the COVID stuff, it goes much deeper than just like misinformation. And social media begins to get at it, because there's a kind of, you know, tribalism going on that you know, the media, I'm glad to hear that the media has contributed to do attitude change as far as, you know, Black Lives Matter movements. But it's also sort of coalesced this ugly glump of disinformation, which is then used by people in political power, or, you know, maybe they agree to, maybe they, you know, it's their true beliefs, to, you know, keep us at each other's throats. And it is really, I'm surprised by it. And I'm kind of an old woman, and I'm kind of surprised by it.
I agree that it's more than just disinformation. You know, when you see that there are certain demographics that don't want a vaccine or want to wear a mask, whether you're talking about white men, Republican men, that there's a systematic sort of contempt for science, medical science, that there's a certain kind of politics that was coming out of this administration where they were talking about herd immunity. It spoke to this idea of survival of the fittest, social Darwinian sort of language. And, Donald Trump was pretty open about saying, like, the problem with Joe Biden is he'll let the scientists back in, right? And that's bad. You don't want scientists having anything to do with COVID policy in a pandemic. Like, I mean, that's pretty openly contemptuous of medicine. So obviously this is about more than just, oh, I was misinformed. Like, there are people out there who are happy to not know what the scientists are saying in a pandemic.
Yeah, that's terrifying at the same time. And Declan had a follow-up question for you. You talked about the importance on data understanding and early education, but do you believe empathy training is also needed? Could that be impactful?
I'm a big believer in empathy across the board in every way. I think people will talk to each other differently and behave differently and relate differently if they have empathy. I think that that's what these movements are all about that I talk about in my book. My book covers the Madison protests and organized labor in 2011 against the efforts to curb collective bargaining. I look at Occupy Wall Street and rising inequality in America. I look at the Fight for 15 and the struggles that working Americans face. I look at BLM and police brutality, right? And structural racism. I'm looking at Me Too and sexual harassment and sexual violence. And so, like, these movements are all, I think, very much premised upon explicitly the idea that we need more empathy, because that's the only way in which the movement's going to be able to succeed in the grievances being heard and being taken seriously, is that when people become personalized and humanized and people can put themselves into the shoes of the other person, I don't think it could be just sympathy. Like, oh yeah, so you had a hard go of it and that's too bad and I sympathize and all and on your way. Like, no, it has to be more than that. It has to be actual empathy for there to be a real change in the system. So, I do think that empathy education, I think these movements are a grand example of that. And so, that needs to be an important part of the process. I think I would agree in terms of formal education. That's why I've committed myself professionally to teaching about social movements in formal settings too.
Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time here. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes, but this has been a really wonderful talk, Tony. Thank you so much for all of the information that you've provided, the research that you continue to do and to share with us. We'll be looking out for your next book, Fake News, and wish you luck in publicizing that. And I will follow up with information with the link for Tony's book, if you'd like to read it, as well as the follow-up Roar article. It was also in the chat, so I hope that you will take advantage of that. And I'm just going to pull up my screen and share with you that if you're interested, oh, that's not it. If you're interested in seeing images from this exhibition or to view the recording from today's event, you can see it at LUAG.org. And then we have a couple of upcoming events. Notations, Lift Every Voice will be in celebration of National Poetry Month next week, as well as LUAG at Lunch, the AAD Senior Thesis Artist Talks. And then on April 15th, I hope you'll join us for the last Art and Dialogue for the spring semester, Creativity and Entrepreneurship with the New Ventures Club. So I want to thank you again, Tony, for your time and for all of the research that you have done. We are grateful to you and hope that we see change in the future, that's for sure.
Thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Tony. Thank you again.
Thanks. I never know how these things are going to go until they're over.